Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors Land Use and Transportation Committee for Monday, April 3rd, 2017. My name is Mark Farrell. I'll be chairing this committee. I'm joined by our committee vice chair, Supervisor Aaron Peskin, as well as committee member Supervisor Katie Tang, and joined by Supervisor Lennon Breed today. I want to thank Leo D'Assis and Jim Smith from SFG-TV for covering this meeting, as well as Erica Major for being the clerk of the committee. Madam Clerk, do we have any announcements?
Yes, please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the April 11th Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. Colleagues, we have a super long agenda of one item. So, Madam Clerk, with that, would you call item number one?
Yes, item number one is an ordinance amending the planning code to require additional affordable housing or payment of a fee for certain sites that obtain higher residential development potential as a result of the rezoning of the Divisadero Street Neighborhood Commercial Transit District.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, this item was sponsored by Supervisor Breed, who's joined us in committee. So, Supervisor Breed, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Supervisor Farrell. Good afternoon, supervisors and members of the public. I'm glad to be able to present this legislation to you today. It will provide more homes for people along the Divisadero and Fillmore Street Neighborhood Commercial Transit Districts, or NCTs. It is a good thing for the neighborhood, and it is a good thing for the city. Let me first make it clear before we get into the details of the legislation. I want you to understand that this legislation does one fundamentally critical thing. It sets affordable housing requirements for pipeline projects in the Divisadero and the Fillmore NCTs at a much higher standard than would be required if they are taking advantage of the NCT density decontrol provisions. This legislation will require pipeline projects to provide 23% on-site affordability or 30% off-site affordability. For units, that would include 6% for those at 55% of AMI, and that's basically a family of four making about $59,000 a year. Up to 8% of those units for 120% AMI. That's about a family of four making up to $129,000 a year, and 9% for up to 140% AMI, or $150,000 a year for a family of four. Instead of the 13 or the 14% on-site requirement grandfathered in per Prop C that was passed by the voters in 2016, this legislation provides affordable housing for multiple levels of wage earners. The former city law provided inclusionary housing at 13 or 14% for those making 55% of AMI or less. It's true that this legislation I'm proposing today decreases the percentage of apartments in this zone for those at the bottom of the scale. This fact has been the main point of contention for opponents, that it turns its back on the neediest of citizens. Well, I contend that we are not turning our back on anyone, but trying to fully see the enormity of the housing needs we face, and we are trying to answer this need in the broadest and biggest way we can, trying to help as many different kinds of families as possible find homes in San Francisco. I will explain the reasoning behind this. We all know the lowest income earners are in desperate need of housing, those families of four making less than $59,000 a year. And we must continue to expand other avenues into housing for those families fighting to get into the next level of income levels. But our housing crisis is more complex than just the lower income wage earners that are in the 55% of AMI and below. Our housing crisis isn't just at one data point. It exists everywhere, and it's keeping middle income earners from being able to afford housing as well. Unfortunately, it's families at nearly every level who feel San Francisco is becoming a city of which they can no longer live, a place where they can no longer afford. That's why this legislation opens up the category for inclusionary affordable housing into 3 tiers. We are seeking ways to keep the fabric of San Francisco intact. There are multiple sources of funding for low-income affordable units: the Housing Trust Fund, the Housing Bond, the in-lieu fees, and job housing linkage fees paid by developers. Anyone above the 55% of AMI, a family, again, making over $59,000 a year, family of four, do not qualify for those particular programs. There's no help other than they earn too much money for a government program, but not enough money to live in the city anymore. We all know these people. These are friends. These are people that I grew up with in my neighborhood. My friend, who basically was displaced from this community, who is a bus driver, making over the $59,000 a year with 2 kids. When she tried to return to San Francisco and the development that she was displaced from, she made $600 over what was required to allow her to qualify to return to her home. We know about the construction workers, the people who build this city, and they make too much to qualify for affordable housing, but not enough to afford the market rate units that are being built. My friend who works for the state and whose daughter had to be uplifted out of the school she loved because she could no longer afford the city, and again, did not qualify for affordable housing. Who's looking out for them? Who's building for them? We talk about gentrification. We talk about the people who have been moved out of the city, but we've not created a pipeline of affordable housing that those people could actually qualify for. And not to mention, until my neighborhood preference legislation, we had no way to give them even a fighting chance of actually accessing that affordable housing. Who's roaming the halls of City Hall advocating for them? Who's looking out for the interests of those people who continue to get pushed out of San Francisco? Low-income affordable housing is critically important. I grew up in it. I grew up in public housing. And I know how important it was for my family. The point is that so is making sure that there are other layers of affordability. And we are not funding it or building it nearly enough. So the best way to ensure it actually gets built is to incorporate it into privately funded inclusionary housing, and that is exactly what this legislation does. I miss my friends. I miss my community. And I'm tired of this particular issue being used as a way to claim it's going to do something that it isn't. I know we can't turn back the hand of time, but at least we can start to get it right now. I don't want to look back, or I don't want the next generation of young people to look back and wonder what happened to San Francisco the same way that I look back and wonder what happened to my community, what happened to our city. The basic and rather narrow question today is, do we want all projects on Divisadero and Fillmore that use the NCT zoning to meet higher affordability standards? I feel strongly that the answer is unequivocally yes, that we should be maximizing affordable housing in these neighborhoods. And now let me give a background of how this will work. In 2012, voters passed Prop C, which set the inclusionary requirements in the charter at 12% on-site and 20% off-site or a fee. In 2014, I passed legislation creating named neighborhood commercial districts on Fillmore and Divisadero. In the summer of 2015, I passed legislation revising those NCDs to make them into NCTs, neighborhood commercial transit districts, meaning residential density would be controlled by height and bulk restrictions instead of a numerical lot area ratio. In other words, more housing units would be allowed within the same given building size without increasing height. This was in line with many other density decontrol zoning changes passed in recent years, and the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors supported my NCT legislation unanimously. The density decontrol provisions in NCTs help create more affordable units since those are set as a percentage of the total number of units. You get more affordable housing and cheaper market rate units without any height or bulk increases for buildings. In that respect, NCTs are a great first step. But I also want to increase the required percentage of affordable units. Unfortunately, I received information that under Prop C in 2012, that wasn't considered possible when I introduced this legislation. But after a lot of careful consultation, we found a way to increase affordable housing requirements under the strict controls of 2012's Prop C. And in December of 2015, I introduced legislation creating higher inclusionary requirements for projects within the NCTs that exercise the density decontrol. Under the then operative Nexus study, I set the off-site inclusionary fee at the highest achievable level and the on-site rate slightly below that at 23% in order to incent on-site development within the neighborhoods. The Board of Supervisors then introduced what became 2016 Prop C, a charter amendment to largely undo 2012's Prop C. That is now passed, and the current citywide inclusionary rates are 33% for a fee-out or off-site construction and 25% for on-site housing. The 2016 Prop C trailing legislation, though, provided tiered grandfathering exemptions for projects in the pipeline. This means, without my legislation, the two current projects in Divisadero could move forward with only 13.5 or 14.5% affordable housing. That is not enough, and I have always made it clear that I want more, and the community has made it clear that they want more as well, and that is exactly what this legislation achieves. The legislation before you says that if pipeline projects choose to take advantage of the NCT density decontrol, they should meet the 23% requirement that I originally proposed back in December 2015. They shouldn't get to use the density decontrol and benefit from a grandfathering provision that was written for projects that aren't getting a density decontrol. So I set the 23% inclusionary requirement to break down as follows. A minimum of 6% of the units shall be for affordable households earning up to 55% of the area median income. 8% of the units shall be affordable to households earning up to 120% of AMI, and 9% of the units shall be affordable to households earning up to 140% AMI. This is geared a bit more towards middle-income earners than other inclusionary housing policies have previously been, and that is for a couple of reasons. We are now requiring roughly an additional 1/10 of the units in these projects to be affordable compared to what was originally the law in 2012's Prop C, and even what is current law in 2016's Prop C. And two, I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, and I've seen far too many middle-income working families, including my friends and family members, forced out by rising prices or even their own rising wages. I am committed to providing more opportunities for them to find a home in their own community. We have two projects in the pipeline right now on Divisadero, one at 650 Divisadero, for about 66 units, and one at Oak and Divisadero that's quite a bit larger. This legislation is the best way to ensure they provide more affordable housing for the broad range of residents who need it. The legislation guarantees that a project using the NCT zoning will hit 23% affordable rather than the only 13 or 14% that had been proposed under the grandfathering trailing legislation in 2016's Prop C. To the additional 15 or 20 families who get an affordable unit because of this legislation, that means a lot. And because of the neighborhood preference legislation that I push forward, 40% of those units will go to the residents of District 5, where they will have a fighting chance of actually accessing the units in their community, which had never existed before the neighborhood preference legislation. Thank you, supervisors, for your patience. This has been a bit of a moving target since we introduced this legislation right before a charter amendment that changed standards citywide. But now the question is clear. Do we want projects that use the density decontrol to meet higher affordable housing standards, or should they get the lower grandfathered rate? My answer is more, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you so much for your time. But also, I wanted to talk about an amendment, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer those questions first and then get into the details of that.
Supervisor Tang.
Thank you for the thorough explanation, Supervisor Breed. So, because I had received some emails about this particular legislation, I'm sure we all did. I just wanted to, I know you've pretty much clarified it, but any of the projects that you mentioned that fall within these NCTs will have 23% on-site affordable housing, and it would have been 13% if it had, were it not for this legislation. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay. And then you mentioned there are two particular projects in the pipeline. How many units would those yield on each of those project sites?
So from the estimates, and I think, Aaron, you might know the answer to this, correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, the one at 650 Divisadero, originally this project had proposed 16 units total. And because of my NCT legislation, the possibility to build 66 units exists. And as a result of this legislation, there will be roughly, I think, 16 units on site, affordable units that are available. So that's basically what this legislation does. So the number of units that were going to be built on the site in the first place are now going to be the number of units that are actually going to be provided to the community as affordable units potentially.
Okay. And then I don't know how far along the other project was that you cited at Oak, and
Yeah,
you don't know
yes.
yet. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Chair Farrell, and through the chair to President Breed. Going through the history of this, the 2012 Proposition C knocked down affordable housing percentages by 20% across the board. So generally, the number that we use is 15% affordable housing became 12%. But in some cases, like in NCTs, there was actually a higher percentage to begin with. So I'm fast forwarding now to the 2016 Prop C and the grandfathering legislation. Actually, if I have this right, and we might need to defer to planning department staff, it was a 20% reduction from whatever the percentage was at the time. That sounds very muddy. Let me see if I can articulate that. In the NCTs, there was actually higher than 15% and higher than post 2012 Prop C, higher than 12%. So the grandfathering legislation actually took that into account. In other words, I actually think that the grandfathering legislation, depending on the year that their environmental evaluation was submitted, is actually higher than 13.5%. But maybe
From my understanding, and maybe it can be explained by the planning department, the range is 13 to 14%.
the range is 13 to 14% if you were the clawback provisions of the grandfathering legislation that attempted to capture some 200 plus units that were in the pipeline wasn't based on 12%. It was based on whatever the percentage was at the time. NCTs had a higher percentage of affordable housing required, and the grandfathering acknowledged that.
So I don't think there was a blanket all NCTs. I think it depended on the neighborhood and if there was a specific...
There were 3 flavors of NCTs that had different percentages of affordable housing, all of them higher than 12% is my recollection.
I would have to go back and look at that. I do know that I think the Mission did, and then the UMU had higher inclusionary rate as well, and those were left in place because there was a value conferred onto the development.
Right, and that indeed is what happened in the case of the 2015 upzoning that Supervisor Breed conferred on Divisadero.
Yes, they conferred value onto the property, but we did not at the same time also increase the inclusionary at that point.
So you're telling me that that is the only NCT that did not end up with a higher inclusionary?
Fillmore and Divisadero, because they weren't part of a neighborhood plan.
So in other words, everything that we did in the eastern neighborhoods where we conferred upzonings and captured additional inclusionary, when we upzoned Fillmore and Divis, planning did not recommend that there be a recapture of affordable housing in that upzoning?
No, we didn't at the time.
And can I interrupt, please, and answer that too? Because that was a lot of the frustration from the NCT in the first place, because clearly, when you are providing what I believe is an incentive to allow for significantly higher number of units, then yes, there should be an additional requirement of affordable housing. And under 2012 Prop C, there was a back and forth between the planning department, the city attorney's office, and we were told, our office was told that we could not do that. We could not do that in the legislation specifically. And so then later on, there was, again, a lot of pressure from the community, and we had continued to maintain these conversations because regardless of whether or not we could do this or not in legislation, the plan all along was to do what we can to require that the developer provides a higher percentage of affordable units on site, and we were going to probably have to negotiate that on a project-by-project basis, which was really frustrating and upsetting. And then later on down the line, we discovered, and this is when I introduced the 2015 legislation, the ability to do a higher percentage requirement, and that's why we're here today. And so you understand the frustration and the communication, miscommunication of what happened through the process.
And my recollection, actually, as early on as I think I had just become a member of the board when you introduced the legislation to recapture some of the affordable housing. I think I co-sponsored that legislation, if my recollection serves me. I know I'm going to get a bad phone call from Dennis Herrera for saying this, but I don't think there was anything in the 2012 Prop C that would have prevented Supervisor Breed from requiring higher inclusionary in an upzoning of these two NCTs, or a rezoning of these two NCTs through the chair to Deputy City Attorney Givner.
Deputy City Attorney John Givner. I can't get into the details of the conversations we had with the supervisor's office and the planning department, but Supervisor Breed introduced this ordinance before the second Prop C passed, which we drafted at her request. But there was a lot, as Supervisor Breed said, there was a lot of discussion among all three parties about what was possible and how it could be done. Ultimately, we came to the conclusion that she could move forward with the 2016 legislation that has now been substituted here.
Absent the 2016 Prop C, this could have been done?
Yes.
Okay. So in other words, it could have been done at the time of the upzoning of the Fillmore and DeVis NCTs.
Well, Supervisor Breed introduced this legislation before the second Prop C. So it could be done. As Supervisor Breed said, there were complications that we were working out, that planning was working out in order to make sure it could happen.
In other words, your legal advice evolved over time.
I can't say that. I, frankly, was not a party to those meetings, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Givner. I think for the purpose of conversation, and maybe this is not important, but I think that we should see these in the same way as we see the mission NCTs that with the 2012 Prop C were actually higher than 12%. So, I mean, I would...
Do you know what those percentages were?
17 and 19.
That sounds about right, but I don't have the exact numbers.
I think 17 and 19. is what they were. So I really think for the purpose of this conversation, we should really, and insofar as it turns out that it was, I don't want to put words in the city attorney's mouth, but legal at the time, although that may not have been the advice, or it sounds like was not the advice that you were given during the upzoning.
And let me just be clear. I think more of it was also, not trying to throw the planning department under the bus, but part of it was working with the planning department and trying to negotiate and figure out what we can do and how we get through this process. So, there were mistakes made clearly, and this is an effort to correct that mistake, and I think that's kind of where we are now.
Well, one of the things that jumped out at me, and let's see if I can find it.
And so, Supervisor Peskin, through the chair, can you explain to me what you're trying to get at? I mean, I understand that, it would have been better if we had this done already during the time when we did the NCT. That would have been the better time to actually do that, but we didn't. But I think I'm trying to understand what your suggestion is as it relates to trying to look at this in the same way as some of the other NCTs within the neighborhood plans, and how that makes sense and what you're suggesting as a result of it.
I think I'm getting at the stated contention that absent this legislation, they would be at 13.5%. And one of the things that popped out at me was the sentence that said that if the board adopts inclusionary affordable housing requirements that are higher than those set forth in sections 428, the higher requirements shall apply. That's at the bottom of page 9.
In the legislation, and I'm probably going to make some amendment. I am going to make some amendments to strike that.
Okay.
Because let me, just to be clear, through the chair, this at the time when we introduced it, we knew that there was a possibility that there would be higher inclusionary rates. But the point is, I don't want to keep changing and changing. I want something definitive. And so I think the reason why we're going to be taking that out of the legislation and making the amendments is so that we make it clear that as a result of these particular NCTs, without question, these are the requirements for those particular projects. Rather than create, because we are going to, as you know, at the Board of Supervisors, make additional changes to the affordable housing requirements. And I don't want to just keep putting these NCTs on hold. This should have been done already, and we need to get this legislation through, and that's the whole point of removing those sections in the legislation.
So, through the chair to Supervisor Breed, are you saying that you're going to remove that sentence on page 9?
We're actually, yes. Specifically, the amendments are to page 7, lines 8 and 9, page 9, lines 21 through 22, and page 11, line 8 and 9, because it's set forth in the legislation, and here's a copy of the amendments.
Okay, I'll look at those. And through the chair to Supervisor Breed, I'm not trying to be argumentative. I mean, I think there's a number of different things going on here, and I'm happy to take them one at a time. At a high level, we're having, I think, a large policy conversation as it relates to citywide affordable housing mixes that yourself and Supervisor Safai introduced, and obviously Supervisor Kim and I have an alternative version, and we can kind of discuss the policy merits of that. Since 2002, when then Supervisor Leno passed, I think unanimously, the first inclusionary law, Section 415 of the Planning Code, I believe at that time it was 12% for AMIs at 60% or less is my recollection. And later on, we had a San Francisco area income, and later on we weren't able to calculate that, so we dropped the 60% to 55%, and that's kind of been the way. Then it went up to 15% at 55%. Then in the 2012 Prop C, it dropped down to 12%, or everybody took a 20% haircut at the bottom of the recession, or as we were coming out of the recession. This is a fundamental change in the distribution and the mix of how and at what AMI levels the city provides affordable housing. And I'm a little reticent to have it in a one-off conversation. I kind of respectfully think that this is a little bit of cart before the horse. I think the larger conversation is the citywide conversation about what the proper mix is, and that's a conversation that has now been had by the Planning Commission, and presumably later this month or next month will be had by the full Board of Supervisors. But I'm reluctant to do it in a one-off situation. I completely understand and respect, and indeed I think I am a co-sponsor of the original legislation to capture the upzoning value in more affordable housing. But as it relates to the mix of 6% at 55% and 8% at 120% and 9% at 140%, that represents a major departure from now a decade and a half of affordable housing policy in the city. And I think we'd be better served if we had that policy conversation as a citywide matter before we have it on a one-off district-based NCT thing that I totally respect. You are now with changed legal advice or evolved legal advice. I know I'm going to get that call from Dennis Herrera pretty soon. You are attempting to fix, but I think we should have the larger policy conversation and settle that issue. I have some other thoughts, and particularly given that the findings here represent that we have all reviewed the Nexus study. I have taken a look at that. And the Nexus study actually provides for a higher percentage of in lieu or off-site at 33%. So I would encourage the maker of the ordinance to consider the 33% instead of the 30%. That's one thought relative to incenting on-site. And then I don't actually know about the two projects that are in the pipeline. You mentioned one of them, I think you said was a 16-unit project.
It's now a 66-unit project.
A 66-unit project, got it. And the other, I don't know what the other is. I have no idea of what the projects are. But I think what we have seen mostly in District 6, but in some other areas, is that where we have conferred additional density or additional height, we've been able to recapture significant amounts of affordable housing. And we just saw it in the case of 1515 South Van Ness at 25%. So I'd also push a little bit to see
whether... Isn't that like a much larger project?
I think that was 140 units. So that may be, but I'd like to get some analysis from staff or see some pro formas about whether or not we can actually make it work at 25%. And then there is the larger policy question about what the mix is. I personally think that, and I have been consistent in saying this, that I'm hopeful there can be some resolution as to how we split the baby. And I know that there's no question that there is a need at all levels except for the luxury level, which has taken quite good care of itself. But I think we should have that larger policy conversation first and then have this kind of side conversation second for what that's worth.
And Supervisor Peskin, through the chair, thank you for your input, because I think that is really definitely the larger conversation in terms of the split. And I think part of my consistent push is what I've mentioned in my opening remarks. You know, I realize that, you know, we have, and you in your history have fought to focus on making sure that, you know, the 55 or 60% of AMI and below were included in these particular developments for on-site inclusionary. But I think part of my concern, and we had this discussion about what we're building in San Francisco, and when we look at the 55% of AMI and below in comparison to the other category of middle income, which is not middle income in San Francisco because it's still not affordable to live here, even with a family of 4 making over $60,000 a year or even just $60,000 a year. Like, they are not qualifying for the affordable housing, and more specifically, as I mentioned, the Housing Trust Fund, the housing bond, the in lieu fees, all these different layers that provide opportunities to do some amazing projects, 100% affordable housing projects, where in the case of, the Willie B. Kennedy apartments in my district, it was amazing, 98 senior units, most for all 100% affordable senior units, but the one person who's, for example, getting a pension, again, can't afford to live in San Francisco, a senior citizen, worked her entire life at the Department of Public Health, just a few $100s over the requirement. I mean, that is the problem for me, and that is why, from my perspective, we need to start looking at a higher AMI in the inclusionary housing, because that's really the only way that we can fund them. And so I know that's still the bigger conversation that we need to continue to have, and I appreciate your comments and your perspective around looking at the percentages in this particular case. I mean, I wish this was already done. It should have already been done. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert. I depend on several city departments and city attorney and everyone else like you do to help give us the best advice, to provide the best legislation based on the intent of what we want to do. I want more housing, but more importantly, I want more affordable housing, and I am trying to I'm trying to push the limit here on what we can do to maximize the affordable housing, but I also, more importantly, want to make sure we're doing it for that next layer of affordability that is so desperately needed. And so I'm open to suggestions or comments of ways that we could potentially look at that 23%. I'm not certain what that means. I mean, we looked at the Nexus study. We looked at, what we committed to when I introduced the legislation in 2013 at the 23%. What is a good mix? We looked at the area median income of the neighborhood and what people are making and who are the people that we're losing in the neighborhood particularly. And again, that's mostly how we came up with the percentage is of what could work to provide a real opportunity for affordable housing for, just that layer of income levels that's missing, because those are the people who are, again, being displaced. And so I appreciate that, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with the planning department and looking at the percentages. I don't want to continue to delay this. I want us to really make the decision, but I also want us to make the right decision of what, is the best thing for this particular case. And I do know we're still having the larger conversation about this, but I do appreciate your comments and your feedback. Thank you.
And I would, if I may, Mr. Chairman, a few observations. I mean, Prop C of 2016 did, I think, 2 fundamental things. Number one was, and maybe I'll sound like a broken record, the inclusionary percentages were never meant to be static. Different things change over time. Cost of construction, land values, sale prices. It was never meant to be rigid. And the problem with the 2012 Prop C was that it stuck it in the charter. So there was no way for the legislative branch, in consultation with experts, looking at numbers and what was maximally feasible, could change it. So the first thing that the 2016 Prop C did was it took it out of the charter. We all agreed on that. We had a unanimous vote to put it on the ballot. The second thing that it did was it said that until the Board of Supervisors acted, it would be 15% at 55% of area median income, and then layered on, and I think we're coming from the same place, an additional 10% of for middle income housing up to 120% of area median income. So, and of course, we said subject to fiscal feasibility analysis, which is now, thanks to the controller and the technical advisory committee and outside experts and consultants, been completed, and that's launched our conversation about what the proper rate should be, and that's the conversation we're going to have. But I think we're coming from the same place, which is we want to acknowledge and produce some of that sorely needed middle-income housing. But there is a vast difference between the pensioner that you're talking about who is a few $100s over qualifying at 55% and taking the policy leap that we're taking here of creating an entire layer at 140%. But Prop C, as of 2016, was additive. We said, hey, we're going to stick with the traditional rates, which by the end of my first tour of duty in 2008 had gone up to 15% at 55%, and we layered on an additional 10%. So I think we all are acknowledging that need. I don't know, I mean, the fact that in this case, we're turning that 15% at 55 to 6% at 55 and taking the what is under Prop C, 10% at 120% and turning it into 140%, I think that bears a little analysis. I'm very interested in what you spoke to, President Breed, about neighborhood incomes, and I would love to actually, I haven't seen that data for this area, but I think that would be very helpful if that data exists or can be shared by planning with the committee publicly, or obviously any information that we get is public information, but I'd love to actually see that data.
And through the chair, Mr. Starr, do you have some information handy for the area median income of the neighborhood?
Unfortunately, our data doesn't go by NCDs, so we just have sort of the Haight and then the Western Addition, and they sort of overlap where Divisadero is. So the Haight median household income is $114,000, and the median family income is $157,000. But the Western Addition is considerably less, and it's just going to take me a second to get it.
Can you repeat those for the Haight?
114, did you say?
114, 150, and then 157, 380, if you really want specific.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, 114,000 for the household income and 157,000 for the median family income.
And that includes the upper Haight?
Yeah, that includes the upper Haight, but it also goes over to Divisadero and captures the swath up into, I think, the Panhandle.
And you can't break that down by kind of sub-area to show us more of the immediate neighborhood?
Yeah, not the information that I have or that's readily available.
And how long would that information take to obtain?
Probably at least about a week, I would guess. But without having the data team here, I couldn't tell you for certain.
Okay.
Retro.
The Western Addition is about to pop up at any second.
Any second, and it's W, so it's at the end of the alphabet.
And I could just tell you a little bit about, this is the data, for example, when we did this for Hayes Valley, when we were dealing with this issue around the grocery store, we had within the Western Addition community, families, low income, a lot of seniors making anywhere from $11,000 to $24,000 a year, but right next to the Western Addition within the same area, in Hayes Valley in particular, it was like $83,000 a year in terms of average area median income household.
And for Western Addition, it's the median household income is $47,000, and the median family income is $58,000.
58?
Yeah.
So for the Western Addition, if you were to use those medians, the medians would basically be very close to the 55% of AMI.
For the Western Addition, yeah.
Colleagues, any further discussion right now? Okay, we're going to open this to public comment in a second. I would just say, Supervisor Breed, appreciate the legislation here, the purpose behind it. I think anytime we're talking about working together to ensure additional affordability and projects that will be built, I'm very supportive of that. I think two things. One, you spoke about an amendment in your amendment. I think one of my larger concerns, generically speaking, is we keep changing the goalposts on people, developers here in San Francisco, and I don't mind. We have those policy discussions, how high we want to make it up front, but if we change the rules in the game midstream, then we run the risk of having a planning process that I think most developers probably think we have anyways that is really destructive towards encouraging more housing in San Francisco. And so I'm very supportive of that amendment to take that out in the future to continue to kind of de-risk the future for these individuals. But I think one question, though, that I do have about, as we have the broader conversation, and you've introduced legislation, Supervisor Peskin's introduced legislation, now we're having a one-off conversation, though. Is the vision here that we're going to continue to have one-off discussions about individual corridors in the city, or we're going to have a blanket policy that's going to apply to the entire city? Because they seem to be going against each other. I'm just trying to think about how we're going to approach this moving forward.
And thank you, Supervisor Farrell, for your question. And I think the point is this should have already been done, and it hasn't been. And I think the goal here was to try and, because we know there are two projects in particular we want to move forward, we want to get them done, and we want the highest amount of affordable housing on site as we possibly can get. The fact of the matter is, we're talking about, in the case of 650 Divisadero, originally proposed a project of 16 units, which would have been larger units, which would have been more expensive with, the 12% on-site affordable housing units. And the fact of the matter is, if they don't want to take advantage of the density increase per the NCT legislation, they could go back to that project. And they're basically getting, a huge, this is changing a project from making one amount of money to making something completely different. And it's important that the give back for that is a significant amount of affordable housing, the maximum possible according to what's being proposed. And the fact of the matter, in these two projects, they knew that this was happening, and they made adjustments to change their projects right away when we added the NCT legislation, and they knew that they were going to, regardless of this legislation, be required to do as much affordable housing on site as these projects would provide. And so this is, from my perspective, I get what you're saying in terms of changing things, but they knew this was going to happen. And so we're at a point where I get it. I know you don't want to have the one-off conversations. I don't want to keep going back here, but it is important so that we can move these projects forward, that we get going with something that's definitive based on the significant incentive that they're getting as a result of the NCT legislation.
And again, I appreciate that, and I think that this is a unique situation that got caught in the middle of Prop C last year. I agree, and I support it very much. And Supervisor Peskin, to take it out of the charter, I agree with that. But what I don't want to see longer term is this one-off, every commercial corridor, every transit corridor that we're going to create is going to have a separate conversation. And I think, despite the fact that we're going to have differences on this board about the inclusionary requirements, the different proposals that are in front of us right now, I like the fact that we're going towards a citywide policy and that we're going to be able to dictate it that way. And from my perspective, I just want to make sure that when we're going, at least from my perspective, when we are going forward and allowing this legislation to go through, that we're acknowledging that this is a bit of a one-off to kind of clean up the past. And now that we have Prop C, we're having this discussion that we're going to hopefully, as a board, as a body, as a city, and as a policy matter for people that are looking to develop and create housing in our city, that we're going to have a citywide policy. We're not going to continue to change the rules on people because we want to encourage the building of more affordable housing, give people predictability, whatever that predictability may be. It might be too high for some people, that's fine, the cost, but we want to create that level of predictability and really not veer from that moving forward. So with that intention and so forth, I appreciate the fact that you've been working on this for years in your district, and that you're going to actually end up creating more affordable housing for a few units here, and I think that's a good thing. So with that, Supervisor Tang.
Thank you very much. So just to clarify, I think given the amendments that are being proposed, for example, on page 7, essentially deleting the language that says if the board adopts higher inclusionary higher housing requirements, the higher requirement shall apply. So, I mean, right now at the 23%, it is higher than what you're saying it could have been, which would have been 13% affordable.
13 or 14 without
13
this
or 14
legislation.
without this legislation. But if for some reason citywide we land on a higher affordability amount, I just wanted to get your rationale behind why you struck out or you're planning to strike out this language.
Because as what was mentioned by Supervisor Farrell, I want these projects to move forward. I don't want to keep changing the rules in the middle of the game. And this is legislation that should have happened even before Prop C was passed. And a big part of holding off on trying to get it through is to have a clear understanding of Prop C, a clear understanding of a newer Nexus study, which we have, and figuring out, what is the best method and how do we create the maximum affordable units for the neighborhood that they're impacting.
So I do understand the rationale for at least the two immediately pending projects, but let's just say moving on into the future, and for whatever reason the board ends up with a higher than 23% inclusionary rate, again for whatever reason, if that might occur, this strikeout would not allow for anything within Fillmore and Divisadero NCTs to actually qualify under a higher affordability rate. So is there any thought about how you would want to approach future projects? Again, not taking into consideration just the two that are immediately pending.
Yes, and Mr. Gibner, I know that this was mentioned as something that, because we didn't want to keep changing the legislation for these two particular corridors because of this should have already been legislation that had been passed and in consultation with your office. It's my understanding that somehow this was recommended for us to do, or can you give me some clarity on that?
Sure, Deputy City Attorney John Givner again. So ultimately, whether to include this language is a policy call for the committee and the board. The board, by future ordinance, could change the inclusionary levels that apply to this NCT up or down, in theory, in concert with a citywide inclusionary ordinance or not. I understand that when this ordinance was initially introduced, the goal of this language was to ensure that if Prop C passed or post-Prop C legislation passed and the inclusionary levels were higher than what was initially proposed, these projects would be subject to the higher levels. Now that the city has adopted the post-Prop C inclusionary levels in order to provide some certainty to the greater level of certainty to the project sponsors here, the amendment would remove the provision that would say these inclusionary levels will automatically change.
So is there, I get what Supervisor Tang is suggesting, is there a way to make sure that future projects, the requirement, whichever requirement is passed, is actually the one, especially if it is higher, is the one that, basically comes into play in these particular cases?
Yeah, if that's what you wanted to do, you could leave this language in, or you could just amend the future citywide inclusionary ordinance to say this new higher level applies to this corridor as well. So that's the choice that you can make today, or frankly that you can make next time the board considers an inclusionary ordinance.
And I think the concern is they're pending projects. We want those to move forward, and there could be future projects that should follow suit under, if possible, a higher percentage of affordable units, and they would anticipate that, of course. And I think the goal is not to create a barrier with this particular legislation.
Right. With the pending projects, you reach a point after they've pulled permits and started to rely on them that we can't change that we can't raise the inclusionary levels any further. But in terms of future projects, you can keep the ordinance as is, which suggests for future projects the levels might go up, or you could address it in a future piece of legislation.
So do you have a recommendation to change the legislation to specify in future projects? Or because the way that the current legislation reads, it could be pending projects as well.
I think the best way to address that specifically, if you're trying to capture specific projects, is to include a grandfathering clause in this ordinance, which would say any project that submitted an environmental evaluation application before X date, say today, is subject to these levels. Any project that submits an application after this date is subject to these levels unless the board increases the inclusionary level citywide, in which case those projects will be subject to that level.
Okay, thank you. That's basically what I want to do for sure.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you, Supervisor Tang.
Supervisor Peskin, you had a follow-up?
I just had a point of information, which is actually Supervisor Breed introduced this before what became the 2016 Prop C was introduced. So I just want to keep the history right, which is this was done completely before Supervisor Kim and I introduced the charter amendment.
And I said that in my opening remarks.
I was saying that to Givner.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly when this particular language came in. It may have been a version after Prop C passed, but before the most recent substitute.
May I, through the chair, to Supervisor Breed?
Yep.
As I said earlier, I don't know what the two projects are or what their status is. I mean, I understand one of them is a 66-unit project that is in one of the two NCTs, but I don't know if they are where they are in the process, whether they've applied or whether.
The one on Oak and Divisadero, I'm not sure where that is. I think it's still very early, but the one at 650 Divisadero is going for its conditional use at the Planning Commission this Thursday.
Okay. Colleagues, any further questions or comments? Or else there's a decent amount of people here. Only one item. I assume we have people in public comment. So we will open up public comment right now. Anybody wish to speak on this item, please feel free to come on up. Everyone will have 2 minutes. If you would like to speak, please line up against the far wall so we can move through public comment as quickly as possible. Again, everyone will have 2 minutes. We want to make sure we get through everyone in a fair and timely manner. With that.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Supervisors, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. My name is Christian Einfeld. I'm an attorney in San Francisco and a member of Neighbors United. And my concern is I'm opposed to Supervisor Breed's legislation simply because I believe that it delivers too much discretion and power to the free market and to developers, which is going to result in the construction of more housing at a level that is beyond what me and many of my colleagues, attorneys, are able to afford in San Francisco. If we build more Beamers and more Rolls-Royces, that is not going to affect the price of Ford Fiestas. And my concern is that what we're talking about will result in the construction of more Bentleys, more Rolls-Royces, and more Beamers, Porsches, and that will never trickle down to the level of the people that I work with. And that's the end of my comment. Thank you very much.
Next speaker, please.
Hi, I'm Jen. I am a member of Neighbors United.
Jen, if you could pull that microphone down.
Sure, sorry. I'm a member of Neighbors United in District 5, and I've lived in San Francisco for about 9 years, in District 5 for 6 of them. I just wanted to say that I really oppose this huge giveaway to developers, and I feel like we should really go back to the drawing board. Multi-level affordable housing is fine, but you don't steal affordable housing from low-income people and give it to middle-income people. You steal it from developers who will be making money regardless. So that's, yeah. I just really have a question, which is like why developers just never really seem to lose out on this deal. I also feel like this really pits low and middle income people against each other and makes them compete for housing, which is just unconscionable considering what's been happening in San Francisco for the last many, many years. And I just really want to reiterate that we should be taking it from the pockets of developers and market rate units. We should be valuing our citizens of San Francisco over the profits of developers. Basically, you know, Supervisor Breed, you promised us the highest rate of affordable housing ever. Like, really, it was supposed to be ever. And I think that anything less than that is just unacceptable. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Renee Curran. I live in the Inner Sunset. I've lived there for the last 20 years. I'm also a member of Neighbors United and D5 Democrats. I oppose this latest version of the legislation that, as Jen already said, was supposed to be the highest level of affordable units ever. 6% does not feel like that's what that is. Looking at 650 Divisadero, that I think that comes to about 2 units. That's because this new legislation is 6% at the 55% of AMI, and then the next level is 120% and then 140%, which I don't think is middle income. That to me is very high income. This is a giveaway to the developers, and I'd ask that you please go back and look at the original, you know, the pre-election version of this legislation and either keep that or improve it. Thanks.
Good afternoon, supervisors, President Breed, Supervisor Tang, Supervisor Peston, and Supervisor Farrell. My name is Rufus Watkins. I'm speaking as an individually from Midtown. I grew up there like Supervisor Breed. Grew up there in 1970 in the Western Addition, Divisadero area. So I'm speaking here as that, as a board, you need to go back to the drawing board. And growing up there, I went by 650 Divisadero and so on and so forth, and I'm going by Carl Nolte's article. The Divisadero is changing, ladies and gentlemen, and you need to go back to the drawing board. The developers, in my opinion, are having a field day in San Francisco with the Board of Supervisors. You know, all the political vocabulary, changing goalposts, is this and that, buzzwords, do not work. So you need to go back to the drawing board and be a compassionate human being, not Board of Supervisors as a body. You know, one of your colleagues, Jeff Sheedy, always brings up St. Francis of Assisi. So if you guys are going to bring up St. Francis of Assisi at meetings, you should live by that. So you need to go back to the drawing board. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and have a good week.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Norm Degelman. I've lived in Coal Valley for 20 years. I'm a retired gardener and a member of Neighbors United, and I'm here to object to the latest big giveaway to developers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Shannon. I've been living in San Francisco 12 years. I've been in the Western Addition. I moved into the Western Addition 11 years ago, and then NOPA sprang up around me. Our neighborhood is bleeding long-term residents, and I do not think that the legislation that you're proposing does essentially anything to address that concern. I have seen over the past maybe 6 years my neighbors, one by one, moving out of the neighborhood. They still come back sometimes to visit and stand around on the corner just to see glimpses of the community that we used to have there, which is now gone. I do not think that the proposed legislation goes even slightly far enough to address this issue. And having worked with different organizations in the neighborhood, looking at trying to provide services to low-income people, I can assure you that there are plenty of low-income people who are struggling to stay in the neighborhood and the communities that they grew up in and that they depend on to live. So I hope that you will reconsider this and have a good day.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Yes, hello. My name is David Wu, and I was born and raised in the Haight in District 5 here in San Francisco. And I just wanted to state my opposition to the current legislation, and I largely see it as a giveaway to large developers. I know that there were a lot of campaign promises made this last election cycle regarding fighting for extremely high levels of affordable housing, specifically for our district in District 5, and I just this legislation flies in the face of such promises, so I believe that it needs to be re-examined and stronger affordable housing levels need to be put in place that do not take away from groups that are fighting to stay in the city and instead take away from those that are already privileged or maybe privileged enough to come in. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
My name is Lori Lederman. Please send this back to the drawing board. This cuts the required percentage for low-income inclusionary units in half, while raising the highest level to 9% and 8% respectively. This is a clear statement of preference for high earners at the expense of those with lower incomes. And this is only with respect to the 23% so-called affordable units. 77% would still be market rate. The math is easy. 140% of AMI means these homes are for people making 40% above median income. Median is the middle. And math tells me that 140% of AMI for a single person brings a gross of $8,250 per month. Market rate of $3,500 for a one-bedroom is a lot of money, but if you make $8,250, you'll have enough money left to live on, and you don't need a subsidy. This is not what San Franciscans voted for when we dumped Prop U. And with this level of density, most of these will not be family units. Policy reflects values. This policy favors high earners over low earners. In this city, real estate developers and home sharing corporations have enjoyed a feeding frenzy of profits, displacing longtime renters, artists, nonprofits, and small businesses, and their profit margins are never questioned or revealed. When so-called affordable housing policy leaves out more than half the population, it is bad policy. Calling it affordable doesn't make it so. Yes, we need a range of housing. What about 75% of median? What about 100%? It is the height of hypocrisy to gut the low end and pump up the high end and call it affordable. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Thank you, supervisors. My name is Lisa Aubrey, and I've lived in the Panhandle for almost 3 decades. A year and a half ago, in December of 2015, Supervisor Breed held a press conference on the 600 block of Divisadero, announcing her proposed legislation to increase the percentage of required affordable housing in new private developments along stretches of Divisadero and Fillmore. She stated, quote, "Most of all, it will be the highest affordable housing requirement ever in the city and county of San Francisco." That legislation was never finalized and has been missing ever since the press conference. The original DeVis Fillmore legislation was written to increase the affordable housing requirement for developments that received a density increase due to rezoning. Again, Supervisor Breed enacted this NCT rezoning in July of 2015. The proposed legislation called for an increase from 12% to 23%, almost double. Now that the 2016 version of Prop 16 has passed, it's created a new baseline, 15% low income and 10% middle income, instead of increasing the affordability requirement. The new incarnation of this law currently proposed would actually reduce the requirement from 15% to 6%. If the intent of the legislation before you is to increase the affordable unit requirements, this legislation is not it. Please vote against it and go back to the drawing board. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
My name is Tony Robles. Good afternoon. I'm with Senior and Disability Action. I'm very concerned about the reduction of the requirement, the affordable requirement. The folks that we serve at my organization, the seniors and folks with disabilities, have gotten hit very, very hard over the last decade, or even more so. Anything that's going to slice and dice and shift affordability. I mean, our folks who are among, who are among the poorest and the most in need, are making more like 30% of AMI, if not that. So I would strongly suggest or urge you to go back and relook at this legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Calvin Welch, Affordable Diviz. I think the most accurate statement that's been made so far today was that mistakes have been made. And I think our task today is to not make any more. The whole question of neighborhood AMI and making what is a regional number of AMI applicable to real-world San Francisco neighborhoods is addressed, Supervisor Breed, in your own legislation, you and Safai and Supervisor Tang's legislation on the inclusionary zoning ordinance. And that is to empower Mo to cut to 20%, no greater than 20% of market rate, any affordable BMR unit allowed. That's in the language of the inclusionary zoning ordinance you are sponsoring. It is not in this ordinance, and I wonder why. You should pick up the language in Section 415 that you are proposing, you, Safai, and Tang are proposing, and add it to this legislation, which simply says you empower Mo to analyze the actual affordable housing levels of the AMI in the neighborhood, and in no case allowed to be 20% greater than or within 20% of market rate. And that includes allowing Mo to lower the AMI levels. That is in the legislation you and Supervisor Tang are proposing to this board on inclusionary zoning. You should amend that language into this legislation.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Dean Preston. I live between Fillmore and Divisadero, and this has been a giveaway to developers from day one. Supervisor Breed has only advocated for any affordability only after protests from the community. This law has been missing in action for over 15 months at this point, and you'll notice you don't have a chamber full of developers up here talking about how this is so painful for them that they won't be able to build. And there's a simple reason for that. Of all the flowery speeches that I hear in talking about affordability here and elsewhere, I don't hear anyone talking about the profits for developers. When Supervisor Breed chops in half the housing for low-income folks and shifts that over to households that make between $100,000 and $150,000, she is nearly tripling the rent those folks will pay and the bottom lines of the developers. This is yet another giveaway. Supervisor Breed rezoned Divisadero and Fillmore to allow tripling and quadrupling of density without requiring any additional affordability. And it is nonsense to suggest that no one knew at that time that you could increase affordability. It is nonsense. Had Supervisor Breed picked up the phone and talked to any housing advocate in the city at the time, she would have been told, as Supervisor Peskin references and as has been done in other neighborhoods, that 2012 Prop C made very clear that that could be done. It should have been done originally. This legislation before you is even worse than the original legislation introduced in December 2015. Let's get real affordable housing, not these barely below market profit centers for developers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Todd David on behalf of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. So I think that data pretty much shows for like the last 30 years that we have not built housing for middle-income people in San Francisco. And so, I totally support the intent. I think that families, teachers, working people are having a really hard time struggling staying in San Francisco. And so we totally support that there's a real effort to keep families and working people in San Francisco. So we applaud you for that. Just a couple of concerns I just want to raise. I think that Supervisor Farrell kind of stated it well, that I just want to make sure that we, as we think about policies, that we really try to get away from one-off conversations. And I understand that this particular piece of policy has been in the works for a really long time. And so this is truly a kind of a unique situation. But certainly it is bad for home creation in San Francisco, for all levels of home creation, when there's not certainty to the marketplace. And so we really want to make sure that as much as we can, that we have certainty so that people can, you have to get financing to build housing. There's a lot of moving pieces to this. And so we really want to make sure that certainty is there for as much as possible. And then I just have one really kind of open-ended question just regarding the Nexus study and saying that it was 23% is the affordable rate. I just wonder, was that Nexus study vibrant enough or robust enough to actually support that number? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Next speaker, please.
Hello, Board of Supervisors. My name is Javier Vigil. I'm 18, about to graduate from Leadership High School and go to college, and an activist from Excelsior. As someone who wants to one day be a supervisor of SF, as someone who grew up here, who loves San Francisco, I must oppose this bill because it threatens young people from living here and accomplishing their dreams in SF. 40% of millennials report moving away in the coming years due to the lack of affordable housing. This is a catastrophe for the economy here in SF. Instead of cutting affordable housing, what we need to do is expand it, like Supervisor Breed once promised her district she would do. As a human being, I beg the Board of Supervisors to go back to the drawing board and make San Francisco youth feel welcomed and at home again. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, Laura Clark, YIMBY Action. I really appreciate the spirit in which this legislation was put forward, the intent to increase the amount of housing for middle-income people in the city. I think that's a worthy goal. But it's my understanding that the increase in density of this project will occur with or without the legislation. The density has already been conferred, and we don't need to do this. This project is being drawn, as evidenced by the speakers, into the debate that we are going to be having going forward about what the makeup of our inclusionary zoning is going to be. And if we continue to make decisions on a case-by-case basis, while I understand that this may have been planned for a long time, we add instability to our system. We are already going to have a bloody murder of a debate about what our inclusionary zoning is going to be. I think that the speakers here today are already getting a head start on that argument. I don't want to see this project get drawn into that argument. I think we need to move forward as quickly as possible. Supervisor Peskin did make one really good point. Increases in allowable density give us the ability to get more subsidized affordable housing. At any percentage we set, at any makeup of that percentage that we set it, if we do upzoning, we get more subsidized affordable housing. It is time to get to work doing the real things that will have an impact, which is upzoning our outlying neighborhoods, is getting rid of the historically racist institution of single-family home-only zoning that was designed to keep low-income and minority people out of neighborhoods. Those are the things that are going to have a real dramatic impact on our middle-income residents and our potential to hold on to those residents. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. My name is Quentin Mecchi. I've lived on Alamo Square for over 20 years. I just want to really clarify and understand exactly what we're doing today. Is this housing policy by anecdote? I feel like we could have actually gone down to an Irish pub and put up some numbers on the board and just had some fun at throwing 140, 130, 120, maybe a little 110. Let's see who gets a bullseye for 75%. That's a fascinating way of making housing policy. I just want to really confirm that you guys are still the actual land use committee. Because then I start to wonder then, so do each of the supervisors get to have a one-off? I think, if we're going to talk about policy, I think Supervisor Farrell might want to have a one-off. Supervisor Peskin, I'm sure he wants to have a one-off somewhere in his district. I think it's a remarkable way of doing housing policy. None of us here are opposed to having increased affordability, especially given the density bonuses that were granted to both of the projects in the NCT. Having said that, I think it was at least a year and a half ago, we were promised from Supervisor Breed's office a housing blueprint. Apparently, the housing blueprint means random numbers thrown together by anecdotal evidence, and that is suddenly our affordability makeup for 2 projects that are going to change the face of Divisadero. So I would suggest we can also hit pause on this, Supervisors. The fact that we're now discussing this the week of the conditional use hearing is borderline ludicrous. Yes, it should have been done. It wasn't done, but that doesn't mean we have to create some really nasty housing sausage right here today while we're just going to make some stuff up. So I would suggest we hit pause on this. Let's actually have a comprehensive housing policy that makes sense, that's actually based on data, and not just sort of stories and anecdotes about people who may or may not qualify for housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tess Wellborn, longtime District 5 resident, D5 Action. Remember, there's some 60,000 units that have already been approved. We've got lots of housing for the upper income people, the over 120% of AMI, that's already approved. We don't have to rush anything else through. The car wash site has about 150 units. I don't remember the exact number right now, but 6% of 150 is a far cry from 15%. We need to get more units for the people who are earning below 55, 60% AMI and 120%. We don't need to start jumping up there. We've got 180% over our target for income for people of those incomes. We don't need to subsidize more of that. It's supposed to be about developers helping out. We want to have a mixed income housing in the Divisadero and Fillmore areas, not housing only for the rich. That's part of what makes livable neighborhoods, is people at different incomes, not 100% affordable units somewhere in the Bayview just to help out those poor, quote, poor people, who happen to be my friends and neighbors too, and who are getting evicted one way or another from our neighborhoods. So what we need to do is look at the neighborhood AMIs. We need to prepare reasonable policy that's based on Prop C and is applicable to more citywide, and get these numbers up for these 2 specific sites, at least to Prop C levels. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wish to comment on item number 1? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Supervisor Breed?
Thank you, and thank you to members of the public for coming out and providing some input. I do want to say that I appreciate Supervisor Peskin and some of his comments. I think that it is important to look at a little bit more data around area median income in the areas specifically, so we probably need a little bit more time for that. I do think we need to, as Supervisor Tang suggested, look at grandfathering and making sure that future projects aren't impacted. And so just a little bit more work that needs to be done. It appears that possibly before we move forward with the proposed amendment, that we should maybe do a week's continuance to give us time. Mr. Starr, you think that's appropriate for some of the information I'm requesting?
Probably. I honestly don't know how easy it is to get that data for the actual Divisadero and Fillmore district, but we'll do our best to do it within a week.
Okay, and then I also want to make sure that we have an idea, or my colleagues on Land Use Committee have an idea of the project in particular and why it is important to look at this in this particular way separately from what the larger conversation will be in the future. So maybe a 1-week continuance before we make any amendments.
Okay, Supervisor Breed's requesting a 1-week continuance. Do I entertain the motion here?
So moved.
Okay, motion by Supervisor Tang. Supervisor Peskin?
I'm happy to vote for it. I was going to say that actually one of the comments that was raised earlier seemed to be worthy of consideration by the sponsor as it related to conforming this legislation to the legislation that Supervisor Safai and Supervisor Breed introduced as part of the larger conversation relative to giving MOHCD the ability to reduce the AMI to maintain pricing that is below market value in that neighborhood. So that might be something. And along the same lines, given what we heard at a level for the Fillmore and the Haight, these two NCTs might indeed benefit from different AMI structures that comport with the surrounding neighborhoods that may be different from one another. Just thought for the intervening week. And I'm happy to vote for the continuance.
Okay.
And then I did have one question, which is relative to vesting of this project at 650. Presumably, if, I guess a number of things could happen, the Planning Commission doesn't necessarily have to hear this on Thursday. To the extent that they grant conditional use, that is still subject to anything this Board of Supervisors chooses to do before it vests. And that is an affirmative nod from Mr. Givner for the record.
Mr. Givner, can you go on the record and make that clear, please?
Sure. So the Planning Commission may grant the conditional use authorization. That CU may be appealable to the board. The entire entitlement process has to be completed before the project has any vested rights.
In other words, a building permit has to have issued.
That's right, which will include, as a first step going forward, a potential appeal to the board if there is one, or a final CU approval.
And the board can appeal to itself, or members of the public can appeal to the board?
Yes, members of the public or 5 members of the board can authorize an appeal of a conditional use decision at planning.
Okay. So we have a motion by Supervisor Tang, second by Supervisor Peskin. Okay, we can take that continuance without objection. Madam Clerk, do we have any other business in front of us?
There's no further business.
All right, thanks everybody. We're adjourned.
All right, now let's talk Cuba.